Breaking news. Donald Trump found guilty by a New York jury of felony charges. This is Democracy Docket.
Mark, tell us what has just happened in New York.
Okay, literally, Paige, this just happened. The jury has returned a verdict. People thought it was going to go home for the night. You know, juries, they get told they're at the end of their day and they say, well, let's just come to a decision so we don't have to come back the next day. And they rendered a big one. They found Donald Trump guilty of all charges in his felony case in New York. This is a landmark moment in American history. This is the first time that a former president has ever been charged with crimes. This is now, we can say, the first time that a former president has ever been found guilty of crimes. And we are in literally uncharted territory as we are 5 months from Election Day.
Mark, remind us what this case is about and its connection to the 2016 election and democracy.
Yeah, so look, one of the great misnomers of this case was that people called it the hush money case. Yes, it is true that Donald Trump paid hush money to a former porn star, Stormy Daniels. There's also, remember, the allegations made that the National Enquirer paid another woman to sort of catch and kill her story about her affair with Donald Trump. And so that's obviously part of the salacious background here. But this has always been an election interference case. Why do I say that? Because Donald Trump's campaign was on the ropes after the Access Hollywood tape came out in October of 2016. Shortly before the election, that tape was released. His campaign was reeling. People were actually talking that he might have to drop out of the election. The Republican Party might replace him on the ballot. And we now know from this trial that in the days and weeks after that, he was facing these crises of other women coming forward. And, you know, for our purposes, let's talk about Stormy Daniels, a woman coming forward saying, I had a sexual relationship with Donald Trump, you know, months after his wife had given birth to their child. And, you know, this was going to be a catastrophe for his campaign. And so in order to interfere in the election, okay, in order to influence the outcome of the election, we now know, based on this verdict, he engaged in a scheme to have his personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, pay for Stormy Daniels' silence. And then that got booked on the books of the Trump organization as if it was legal fees. So the felony here was that illegal how it was treated on the books by the Trump organization. And the aggravating factor were the election law and tax implications of that. So that's how we got here. But boy, do we have a road in front of us now, Paige, 5 months before the election.
It took these jurors in New York a day and a half, 2 days to come to this verdict. Obviously, this verdict was returned fairly quickly. What does that mean?
Yeah, so look, I think from a standpoint of appeal, and I know we'll talk about that, the jury verdict process played out ideally for the prosecution, okay? Because you didn't have a jury that just reflexively convicted, right? You didn't have the jury, you know, gets read the jury, the instructions, goes back, and 20 minutes later, and comes back with a conviction, because that would have suggested, although legal, by the way, that would have suggested that maybe the jury didn't carefully consider and deliberate. You also didn't have a situation in which the jury took days upon days upon days and was forced by the judge to reach a consensus, right? We plan for that in the criminal law, where a jury is just taking days and days, and they come and they say, Your Honor, we're deadlocked. And then it becomes very dicey about how hard the judge pushes the jury to find unanimity, because they have to find unanimity in the finding of guilt. So in some ways, this played out like in an ideal time frame, which is that it was a quick verdict, as you say, but it was not a shockingly fast verdict, right? It was quick, but not fast. They over the course of 2 days, they asked some questions of the judge. They asked for instructions, you know, and so it is clear that the jury deliberated in this case. They treated this process seriously as jurors, but it also shows that that there was unanimity, that there was not a forced, you know, that people were like, oh my God, they're never going to let me leave this room, this deliberation room, if I don't capitulate. It is clear the jury came to a unanimous decision. So what it says is that the government proved its case. It proved it overwhelmingly. I think anyone who paid attention to the evidence would say that. And I think it stands up things very well as we look towards the next steps, which will obviously include an appeal from the former president.
Mark, you mentioned next steps and the appeal. What happens first, an appeal or
So
sentencing?
typically what happens next is sentencing. And so the way that works is, a whole bunch of information. The court collects a whole bunch of information about the crimes and the victims and, impact statements and, financial condition of the defendant, and then has to make a decision, by the way, whether to let the defendant be free pending sentencing, right? Because he's been out on bail, but now there's a jury verdict. So a new decision has to be made on that. I think the judge will almost certainly let him remain free pending sentencing. But that will happen. And then you will have a sentencing, a sentence imposed. There'll be a hearing, briefing by both sides, a hearing. Donald Trump will have an opportunity to address the court and express contrition. I wouldn't, wait for that moment. But normally you would have a defendant who's convicted of a crime, what's called allocute. It's called the allocution. It's when the defendant addresses the court and says, Your Honor, I'm really sorry. I shouldn't have put myself in this position. We'll see what Donald Trump does. And then the whole thing then goes up on appeal to the Court of Appeals. The idea is that you don't want piecemeal appeals. You don't want an appeal on parts of the verdict, parts of the rulings, pre-verdict. You don't want then a separate appeal on sentencing. So the way it typically works is all of these issues get bundled up together, and all of the complaints that Donald Trump and his lawyers have accumulated over the last few weeks all get sent up in one appeal, from evidentiary rulings during the trial, jury instructions, things that may have happened during deliberations, the verdict form, the sentence, right? All of it gets bundled up in one thing. Now, I think Donald Trump's lawyers will probably try to two-step this. They will want to immediately try to get an appellate issue up on the verdict. I think that will not be successful. I don't see a reason why it would deviate here, particularly since I don't think he'll be incarcerated during the period of sentencing. So there's no real interest that is at stake other than his reputational interest. But it would not surprise me if you see an attempted two-step process here.
Timeline wise, we saw it took a while for these charges to come, took a little while for it to go to trial. The trial itself took a couple weeks, jury deliberation, a few days. What does the timeline for an appeal look like? Is there a deadline by which Trump's team has to initiate this appeal? What does it mean for the calendar? What does that appeal look like?
Paige, there is a calendar for appeal, and but let's be honest. His lawyers have already come out of the courtroom and said we're going to appeal, right? So they're not gonna take a lot of time here. I am sure they have already been drafting their appeal, and so I suspect when they come out and say we're going to appeal because they think this is wrong, they're gonna move very, very quickly to get something on file. Like I said, probably even before they're eligible to. They will, but they're going to disagree with this verdict, and they're going to want to be moving really quickly. Now, Paige, that doesn't mean the courts will oblige them. We've become very used to, in the civil law context, in all of the voting cases we talk about, emergency appeals and shadow dockets and stays and injunctions. That really isn't a thing in the criminal law. And this has been quite frustrating to many of us who think Donald Trump should have been on trial in more places. From the standpoint of the criminal courts, he's been convicted. He's not incarcerated pending any process, and so his appeals can work their way through the process. And I don't, by the way, think he'll likely be incarcerated pending appeal. I think he will be out on bail until all the appeals are extended. Now, that again will be another decision point for the trial judge. But I think that the courts in New York will be in no special hurry to hear this case. So I think you will likely have a sentencing in, a matter of weeks or months. The judge, will issue a scheduling order, or may have already. But then you will have the appellate process play out over the course really of months, not years, but months. So, in a normal case, I would say sometime late summer or fall, we would start to see the Court of Appeals have argument and decide the case. And I should say in New York, it is the appellate division before people write in. I know the Court of Appeals in New York is the highest court. It's the appellate division in New York.
So if it's going to take a while, Donald Trump will have this guilty verdict on felony charges following him around for the election this year. Do you expect Republicans or the RNC to say something about those charges beyond, these are bogus, they shouldn't have happened? Do you think Republicans will take action in some way to remove Donald Trump as a candidate if these felony charges are going to stick?
Donald Trump is the Republican Party. The Republican Party has surrendered any decency that it ever had. It has surrendered any independence that it ever had. It is nothing right now other than the lapdogs and the lackeys and the election denier spreaders of Donald Trump. So whatever hope you might have that the Republican Party would have an ounce of shame, an ounce of decency to do the right thing or say the right thing, forget it. They will embrace Donald Trump for being a felon. They will celebrate Donald Trump for being a felon. They will promote Donald Trump as being a felon. It is sickening. It is disgusting. And it is the reason why everyone needs to get out and vote for Joe Biden this fall.
Mark, the big question people are asking is Donald Trump still qualified to run for president and serve as president if he has been convicted of a felony?
Sadly, yes, Paige. The founding fathers tried to anticipate all of the evils that we could face in American democracy, but it never anticipated a Donald Trump. It never anticipated that you would have someone who was indicted and convicted of felonies, but would want to run for president. They never anticipated the Republican Party. They never anticipated that there'd be a political party so depraved, so soulless that they would nominate and support a convicted felon running for president. And they had too high an estimation of the American public that it never occurred to them that you would have a sizable portion, almost half of the American public, willing to vote for and celebrate a convicted felon running for president. So, Paige, the chance that we had to keep Donald Trump from running for president was squandered by the majority of the U.S. Supreme Court when they allowed an insurrectionist to appear on the ballot. That was the pivot point. That was the critical moment in which the courts failed democracy. At this point, Donald Trump will be on the ballot. Our soul as a nation will be on the ballot. Our decency as a country will be on the ballot. What we will tell our children and our children's children, what we did and what we were in 2024 will be on the ballot. Let's just hope that right wins out. Thanks for joining us. To stay up to date on all the election and voting rights news and the latest in Donald Trump's criminal and civil cases, subscribe to Democracy Docket's free daily and weekly newsletters. The link is in the show notes below.